Thank you for joining us for this special video roundtable with Smarten Spaces and PlaceTech. I'm Paul Unger, editor of PlaceTech. Thanks for joining us. In the next hour, we will explore where we are right now in terms of changing working environments and where we are headed in the near future. We all know the background about working from home, the panic in April, everyone downloading Zoom. We don't want to go over all that. We want to bring it right up to date. On our panel today, we have landlords and developers, a major corporate occupier, and an office tech specialist. Please do get involved and put your questions to these panelists in the Q&A box at the foot of your screen, and I will come to those during the conversation. So let's get started. Please, can I ask the panel to introduce yourselves as I come to you, starting with Dinesh.
Okay, hi Paul, thanks. I'm the founder and CEO for Smarten Spaces. We're a technology company that basically started about 3 years ago, and we've built pretty good platform to be able to make offices smarter and better. And obviously at a time like this, we're working through almost 43 cities around the world, just doing our deployments of our back to work technology. And I've been in tech for about 25 years, working through with companies like Cisco and AT&T and others. But I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Annie?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm Annie Rinker, the Director of Operations under the Office of Innovation at Hines. For those of you who don't know, Hines is a global real estate development, investment, and management firm. We currently have a presence in about 225 cities and around 250 million square feet under management. We also have about 165 projects in the pipe. Under the Office of Innovation, I specifically focus on our flexible office strategy and some of the technologies and R&D that go into our flex offices, anywhere from co-working up to speculative suites that we're building throughout our portfolio, how we service them, and how we provide that type of flexibility out to our tenants.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And Mary?
Hi, Mary Curtis. I lead energy and sustainability as well as our digital strategy at HP for corporate real estate. And we too are in over 200 sites, and so about 60 countries around the world. And currently working on developing our digital strategy for the workplace and what does that mean for the workforce of the future. So a lot of exciting things going on, and happy to be a part of this conversation. Thanks, Paul.
No, thank you. And last but not least, Jacinda.
Hi there, Jacinda Laughlin from Nuveen Real Estate. First, I want to say thank you to Smarten Spaces, PlaceTech, and Paul for facilitating this. Very excited to be amongst these panelists today, talking to you about the future of work. For those that don't know, Nuveen Real Estate is a real estate asset manager. We have about $130 billion in assets under management. We are a subsidiary of Nuveen Asset Management, which also invests in equity and fixed income. They have about $1 trillion in assets under management, and all of us roll up underneath the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association. So we're the asset management arm for TIAA.
Thank you. And Dinesh, we'll start with you. I mean, you say you're active in dozens of cities. Can you just give us a flavour of what you've seen out there during this time, and what have your learnings been that brings us up to today? Oh, if you just unmute yourself, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. So, it's been interesting because, we've started working with companies that have got manufacturing facilities as well as offices. And at the manufacturing facilities, their bigger concern is, how do I make sure that the workforce that is coming back, because in the factories, the workers need to start coming back, that they do their health declarations, that, there's contact tracing inside. They've divided it all up into zones, but heavy use of technology to be able to make sure that whoever is coming back, actually feels comfortable, right? Also making sure that if they do have incidents, it's those zones within the factories that actually get closed down and sanitized and things like that. And then on the office side, it's largely been, I'd like to break it up into 3 categories, Paul. The first is in countries where we've seen sort of a lot of cases, I think the workforce coming back has been trickling in. So it's been about 10 to 15%, basically max at any given point in time, and heavy focus on safety. Now there's enough space because obviously there are less people that are coming back to work, but they look at the whole journey of the employee and they say no stones unturned, right? Because you can't take a risk, because you've got to make sure that even before the employee comes to work, you've got all the right checks and balances, right? And then in the countries where people have started coming back to work, half the seats are gone because you obviously have social distancing that has been put into place. And so people are looking at new ways of managing their spaces. They've started to think about how do they put in, a lot of desk management technologies, put in sensors, put in different ways to check in employees. But that's what's happening in countries, particularly here in Asia, and I know some parts of the US as well. And then there's a third category that had started to see, people come back to work. They're in the essential category, but they're starting having issues where the people coming back, like the employee base needs to know, when do I come back? Do I come back for 3 days at a time? Do I alternate? Which departments come back together? So this whole thing of the workforce and how does that align with the workspace is starting to come back together. So we've really seen three categories. And actually across every one of the deployments we've done and the customers that we're talking to, they're saying we're not doing this just because of COVID. We're doing this because we believe here's an opportunity for us to think of the future workplace, a workplace which is going to be very flexible, where cost is going to be managed very effectively, where we know, a lot of what is happening in basically our spaces. But that's where the market's headed to, Paul, and it's differing by country and differing by just from a timing perspective right now.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much for that sort of scene setting there. And Mary, you've got 20 million square feet of office around the world, and you own a large portion of that, but not all of it. I mean, have landlords been proactive or not when it comes to helping get back into some of those buildings?
Well, most of the buildings that we've gotten back into so far are our owned assets, and that's because they're primarily our lab, R&D, and manufacturing space. And so, so for those buildings, we've definitely done all of our due diligence, like Dinesh is saying, with all the right protocols. But I am very interested in that next wave. I'm starting to engage landlords and understanding where they believe their responsibility starts and stops. So I think we're looking at, which sites make the most sense to start that next wave and think about the new way of working in terms of really leveraging space for collaboration purposes. So I'll say that we're just not there yet with that landlord conversation, but I'm really excited to get started on that next wave, and now is the time definitely to start preparing for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what will you be looking for from landlords to help with that transition? Is it around tech? Is it hygiene? How do you sort of break that down for an action plan?
Yeah, I think, all of the above for sure. It's we're also looking at, like Annie was talking about, drop-in space, things like that, where we're just going to need ad hoc options. And so for those kind of spaces, we want to understand what the experience is going to be when the employee books a reservation, how that platform works. How can we make the experience consistent across the world and across all of our sites? So we might be working with a different landlord in different areas in the world, but trying to build a platform that for our employees will be very similar experience. And then also we want to know how effective these spaces are for us. So are we really getting our money's worth, when we're reserving spaces for collaboration purposes or for meetings? And so how do we track that? So I'm looking to landlords to help me understand how best to measure that, especially if you're using that space. Really, we're not sure, what's next. And so how do we know to measure the effectiveness of this new way of working?
Yeah, sure. It really plays into the value in the finances at the moment with such an uncertain outlook. And Annie, tell us a little bit about the different approaches that you've been weighing up from a Hines innovation point of view.
Yeah, I think a lot of the items that Mary brought up are things that really the Office of Innovation was founded to just dig deeper into and determine how Hines should be implementing them, what the customers want, how that impacts our assets, what that should do to our property management. And so the Office of Innovation was founded around 3 years ago, and we sort of have a couple different pillars that we look at. I think agility is one of them. And if you're looking at a spectrum of the sort of digital transformation, we think of two different buckets. We've got sort of the customer driven side and then the internal driven side. So what are we doing for the clients in our building, their employees, and then guests also that are visiting the clients. And then you've also got sort of the real estate side, the security, the management side. And so I think that when the start of the pandemic, we really obviously we're looking really closely at the customer driven side. So as it comes to movement, access, how can we continue to promote wellness despite the pandemic going on to encourage our clients back to the buildings? That's something that we looked a lot at. And the whole concept of agility and flexibility in co-working was something that Hines started to look at with the Office of Innovation. But I think the pandemic has really pushed a lot of people like Mary and HP into thinking about that. What does it mean for their global portfolio strategy? And so it's pushed Hines, I think, even further down that path. Pre-pandemic, we have two co-working locations, one in Houston and one in Salt Lake City, but we are now evaluating our global portfolio to see how can we add in that flexibility. And I think one of the interesting things that we've done is that we look at the co-working and flex spaces not as just a product that we can offer our clients across the globe, but also as this R&D space. And so, for example, in our Houston location, we have over 150 sensors that we've deployed. We're trialing out 4 different companies, and we're gathering that data to see, internally, what that can tell us about utilization, how that can help us define the build out into future locations, but then also how can we provide Mary some information? How can we inform her how her clients or how her employees are using the space? How are they moving throughout the space? How can we help her in the current environment, social distance, and determine, where people need to be and where they're going? And so, for us, I think it is twofold. Unfortunately, we started down this path far before the pandemic, but it has helped us really inform how we continue to develop this product, how we can engage with clients, and really how we can provide them something that is future-proofed into the next 12 months when we're still dealing with the pandemic, but then also beyond that.
Yeah, sure. And Jacinda, similarly, tell us about the factors that you're weighing up in the equation of sort of getting it right for occupiers and for building types and models, and some of the approaches that you're considering at the moment, please.
Yeah, really similar themes. And I think just kind of taking a step back, when I think of the future of office, I tend to think of this term that I don't think I coined. I'm sure someone else said it before me, but is omni-channel office. And if you're familiar with the term omni-channel, it's probably in the context of retail. Amazon's a great example. I can go on my phone, I can order a pair of running shorts, have them delivered to my house, try them on. If they're not working, go back online, say, I want to return them, and then drop them off at the Kohl's. It's 5 minutes from my house. And so that's a seamless online to on-site experience in retail. And I think that facilitating that in the office space is going to be key going forward. I see there being kind of 3 foundational components to an omnichannel office. And by the way, I define that as the digital and physical infrastructure that you need to be your most productive. So just really simple and sweet. So the 3 components are the hardware. Usually we think of laptops, but I tend to think of the building infrastructure as part of that hardware layer. That's really the backbone on which you can put different software layers. And I tend to break out the software layer into the building softwares and the systems in the building, and tenant engagement apps that act as a platform to be a consistent dashboard plugging into all of those different building systems. And then the other software piece is a sort of enterprise software piece. And so what are our clients in the building using for their email, for their calendars, for file sharing? And ultimately, I think it's going to be the integration of all three of those things that's going to provide, the best opportunity and flexibility, this term that, I heard from all the other panelists, to be able to promote, the most productive work amongst a variety of different employees and types and ways of working. So that's how we tend to look at it. And then, if you think about the integration, that would be, where you get to the point that if you're making a room reservation, one, it's tracking, to that employer that you're utilizing that room. It's syncing with your calendar, so you're not showing up as available. You've got the room details in the calendar, and maybe there's even this automatic email that prompts you to start the visitor access management process. And the folks that are coming into that meeting, you say yes, confirm this time, this place, and then that kicks off them being sent a QR code or something along those lines to come into the building. So yeah, just kind of taking a step back, that's the sort of approach and framework that we've been thinking about these sorts of things and what the future of office would look like.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see questions already coming in. We'll turn to those now. Question from Martin for all of the panel. How are you finding different employee cultures across the world? How are they affecting businesses and the way they're adapting to the workplace? Dinesh, do you want to maybe report any anecdotes or any data from different geographies?
No, I think, it moves, it starts from this sort of thing about attracting employees back in, right? And so different strategies are being used. But I think eventually when people start coming back, and I had this one incident where one of the employees that was working at one of the client sites said, hey, I feel isolated at home. So I was very excited about when the office opened, right? So I came back, but I can't see any of my colleagues around, and they're sitting in all different floors, and everything's got redistributed. And I don't like that. I don't associate with the company anymore. And so I think workplace has a huge impact on the culture of an organization, right? At the end of the day, I know there have been a lot of strategies in place for remote, and this is not just in the US, or it's not just in Singapore. I think this applies basically across the globe. So everybody's given us the feedback that you got to fix that cultural aspect of, well, I got the workplace, but how do I create the right engagement? And it begins with, where do people sit? How do they sit? How do they feel that they still belong to the workplace, right? But that's what we really experience around the whole question around culture.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share thoughts on different employee cultures across the world from within your own organizations? Any observations?
I'd love to jump in there.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question, Martin. And I would say that it's not just geographically based, but there's, different cultures in different industries, different cultures at different employers, and then personality, I think, quite frankly, plays a role in it as well. So starting to think about client segmentation, and again, how to meet different needs from different types of clients, be that client being an industry or a specific tenant or an individual. One of the things that I think is funny is I've heard on a few different panels that introverts right now are really thriving in this environment, and the extroverts are struggling a little bit. They're wanting to go into the office and missing that camaraderie. As an extroverted introvert, I do actually enjoy working from home, but then it's nice to be on panels. And those are broad generalizations, but I think that that's really key. I think that you see industries or roles in engineering and that sort of thing that, for quite some time, work from home or flexible work options have been a part of that department and that segment of the industry. And so this isn't necessarily new to them. And you've got a lot of those tech companies kind of making bold statements, embracing, remote work indefinitely. Whereas there's other industries where, being in the office is a much bigger part of that culture. So it's just, I think also acknowledging that like maybe before we were a little bit more of default to in office, you have to be in office. And right now we're at the other end of the extreme where it's everybody unless essential is at one point in time during this pandemic was, working from home. And I think that we'll settle somewhere in the middle and just try to facilitate, enable all those ways of working.
Yeah. And Annie, do you see that some of these sort of changes to the workforce will stick? And what does the reshaped workforce look like, do you think, coming out of this lockdown situation?
Yeah, I think Jacinda nailed it on the head. I think it really does vary person to person, company to company, industry to industry. And really right now, country to country, location to location, I think, Texas is going to be different than DC and it will be different than Singapore. And I think we're back up to near 100% occupancy in China. So it really, I think, depends a lot on the end user and where they're located. I do think one of the things that we're going to see as a result of all of this, and I don't think that this is new or that groundbreaking, but it's sort of this flight to a higher quality of product that we need as developers, we need to develop, and as end users, they're going to request. I think one of the interesting things with our industry is that, we basically have to adjust ourselves now, I think, more to what the customer wants, which really is a standard in most other industries, but it hasn't necessarily been in real estate. And I think a lot of it has to do with the capital markets and the power that they've sort of had over development and dictating what we build and how we build. But I think really now the money is going to flow to groups that are providing customers what they want. And so that's going to sort of develop this, flight to quality where developers are going to start developing higher caliber assets that provide more of the well features. So natural sunlight, access to amenity space, outdoor space, et cetera. And I think that that's what customers are going to demand. So to Jacinda's point, like if they're not, we're sort of on the far end of the spectrum right now. So we need to think as developers and managers, how do we bring the people back to the office? And doing that makes a product that they want to come to because they don't have to anymore. And now that we're sort of shifting that and saying you don't have to come to the office, we really need to start dissecting the elements that we're putting into our buildings that will make people want to come back and will allow for the collaboration. I think the pandemic happened at such a fascinating time in history because not only, are we at a point in technology where if this happened 20 years ago, the internet infrastructure wouldn't have allowed us to have this, Zoom call right now, but also what people are doing and how they are doing it has fundamentally shifted over the last 10 years. And so now we have heavy EQ-based workforce rather than an IQ-based workforce. And so that also was something that was happening pre-pandemic. And so now you have this sort of collide of all of those elements that are forcing developers to think about the products that they're providing. And this is really specific to office, although it can be said about sort of all the different industries or asset types right now. But I think that that's really what we're looking at is that we have to really think about the products that we're developing now because people will have an option going forward. Whereas before we didn't necessarily need to give an option because if you build it, they will come. But now it's like, if you build it, they might have the office at home or another option to go work out of. And so what are you going to do to bring people to that development project that you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mary, when it comes to sort of remotely managing workforces, which obviously you've had to do as an organization, and then there will come a time where you've got some remote management and then some people in various offices in the next wave of returning. Are you looking at particular systems for ways of managing that, of blending the remote and the in-office?
Yeah, well, we've been doing that really for a long time because we do have such dispersed teams. So there will always be some people on site and other people virtual. I think the biggest challenge, though, is the collaboration. And we really want to get to a place that we can have a workspace that is so flexible and creative and that is going to, like Annie said, encourage people to come to collaborate, but also, feeling safe and secure is the number one priority. I think, for us, those collaboration tools are a challenge to get our hands around. What is that magic, bullet that's really going to make these teams able to collaborate? And some collaboration you absolutely can't do virtually. So if you have hardware that you need to see in person and touch and understand how it functions, those are always going to be on site. So I think it's definitely a combination, but we know for our workspace, we typically had a very traditional workspace before COVID, where it was a one-to-one ratio for just desks to people and assigned desks. And we're definitely not going back to that. So what does this next wave look like? I think it is a lot about the scheduling and reservation system, but I saw one of the questions was understanding how employees are working. That's super important to us now, as we the kind of data and insights you can get from people coming on site is going to be more beneficial than ever. But having a portfolio that you can adapt really quickly to what you're experiencing, what the information is that you're getting, is going to be really key for us. So I think it was Annie that said adaptability and flexibility, that those absolutely key for us. And how we leverage technology to do that, I think is kind of like the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, and thinking broadly about the digital strategy at HP, has that been turned on its head? Have you had to sort of start again and rewrite? Or what have been some of the fundamental changes, if any, to that over the last 6 months?
Yeah, so I'm responsible for our corporate real estate digital strategy, and what that means is how do we use technology to optimize space and utilities, also improve the user experience and productivity. And so that can mean a lot of different things. I think from the optimization standpoint, we've already been working on and deploying a lot of technology for fault detection and analytics and occupancy sensors. So that technology's been in place. I think what's turned on its head is probably how do we get that more granular? And when we think about having a whole campus that maybe will flex certain days, how do you optimize that campus for that new work schedule versus a typical run rate of 8 to 5 p.m. And so so I think our systems, what we're looking at, we just need to understand how to continue to optimize that over time and create the best experience. And so one of the pilots we did right before COVID was an app that we could control the user's environment from the user's phone. And so having that technology available for them to dial up and down their HVAC and their lighting, we got great feedback on. So that was just a pilot. It happened to coincide completion right before COVID, but the feedback we got from that was really great. So so we'll be looking more at that as well. So not really a kind of a flip on the head, flip over our strategy, but really dive in more into what of that technology suite is really going to make a difference for our employees.
Yeah, and Mary and Annie, you've both mentioned about sensors, and you've been sort of monitoring space utilization. We had a question earlier on about who you've been using and which sensors or manufacturers. Do you know any of the partners that you could share with our viewers today?
Yeah, I can jump in. It's interesting because we obviously have a ton of customers across our global portfolio, but we can't necessarily go in and install sensors in all of their spaces. And so we're dependent on, customers like Mary to tell us about some of the R&D that they're working on. And then one of the benefits, again, of us having our own in-house co-working space is that we can provide some of that R&D ourselves. So at our co-working location, the Square, we're trialing Proxy, Spacewell, Density, Point Grab, Verge Sense, and Aware. And they don't give us all the same information, but some of them do, some of them have some overlap, but we wanted to create a dashboard using all of those sensors to start to determine the data that we're getting, compare data points between different companies. And then again, some of them give us different metrics that are important to us to monitor in the space. And so, I think in a perfect world, what we can do is leverage that information for our property management and facility management teams to talk to some of our clients out there to say, you know, here are the trials that we ran. This is the data that we were able to get. This is what we ultimately did with that data. And so we can provide that as an added value to being a Hines customer and allow that some of that research to open up to the different customers. I think within the space too, you know, in addition to sort of telling our larger tenants and customers what information we're getting, it gives us actual data on what's happening in that space. And so we can sort of use it as a tiny little test kitchen to say, hey, this is what we're seeing from an occupancy standpoint, or even comparing that. You know, one of the things we're doing in Houston right now is looking at what is the occupancy of our co-working space, you know, for people coming physically into that location versus the rest of the building, because we've got some occupancy metrics of people coming into the building, but it's interesting to compare that to what we're seeing in the co-working space right now. We're actually seeing a higher occupancy in our co-working than the rest of the building.
Yeah, absolutely. Jacinda, similarly, you mentioned about tenant engagement platforms and other tech that you've employed. Can you share with us some of the ones that you've been trialing at Nuveen?
Yeah, definitely. So when I say tenant engagement apps, what I mean is having there be a go-to place for all facility needs for the different tenants in a building. And so our strategy in this somewhat nascent space has been to, like, okay, over the next number of years, we're going to need to plug in a ton of different things in the back end, you know, to have there be more autonomy for the tenants over lighting or air control in the room, or to have there be, you know, access control, mobile touchless access control. This involves a ton of different systems in the back end of the building, but what we wanted to do is have the front end be consistent for the tenants, because it might just be me, but the information overload or having to go to 5 different apps for things is just is time and energy consuming. And so that's been our approach, is figuring out, okay, for each of the buildings, what's the best tenant engagement app in which we're going to do these integrations on the back end over time, because these things definitely do take time. I think right now with one of our app providers, we have a list of like over 25 integrations that we want done, and that requires engineer time on their end, and then also engineering time on the you know, company that they're integrating with. So just putting that list all together, coming up with a prioritization, what are tenants saying that they want. 2 other really key pieces with tenant engagement apps is very immediately opening up communication between us and all of the building users. So having that be a place where when people are looking for information around COVID-19 protocol or you know, anything along those lines, they can go into the app and that's very easily available. So I think it's really important to be communicating with our clients what we are doing, the steps that we are taking, and then likewise to be listening to them even more, sending out short form surveys to understand, you know, what features or amenities they might want, other things that they might want done, you know, as to, you know, to be more productive in the office space. So I think that as well, you know, Mary was talking about optimizing over time and trying to figure out, you know, what it is that's helping employees be productive, what's bringing them into the building and what's helping them collaborate. And I think there's no better way than to ask them just in short, simple surveys over time and just continue to iterate that way.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Dinesh, we've heard a bit about the sort of money and the financial side of things, which is being squeezed for a lot of people at the moment. Where do you think the onus is for investing in some of these innovations? Is it on landlords? Is it on tenants? You know, who pays for this stuff? And are there the budgets out there at the moment for? A lot of people want change; they don't always want to pay for it.
Yep. No. So, firstly, you know, all that was said by Jacinda, Annie, and Mary was music to my ears, because you know, we spend all our time building that technology, right? And, you know, it's interesting to see, Jacinda, you said you had, I think, almost 25 integrations. And, you know, sometimes I've seen projects where you had to do 60 integrations, right? So that's just the right way to go, because you want to give that full experience. But, you know, I think when it comes to the money, right? Look, there's a great opportunity, because to the point Annie mentioned, when you as a developer start to provide a much higher quality product, right? It's got to be about the physical building, but it's also got to be about the experience, right? And so if you invest in that area, I think at least with most of the real estate companies we work with, when they've invested in the areas of providing the flexible space as an option to the fixed spaces, that's been a big win for them, because the overflow can be managed. But it has to be the same experience for the employee. You know, the employee should not feel that, oh, I'm getting punished by going into the flex area and not into the main area, right? The experience has to be sort of consistent, right? So investing in technology has its own gains when it comes to, basically the landlord, because it just opens up newer opportunities for them. Also in things we've seen around tenant engagement, there's definitely money to be made. Particularly, I think what COVID has done is it's made sure that we all get so used to getting everything through the different apps that we have now in your precinct or in your building. You may have a lot of services that you need on an everyday basis, but you don't know about them, right? So you're willing to spend on it, but it's a convenience that you're offering, and that's a whole lot of tenant engagement things that actually go on, which can also generate money. So I think that's on the landlord side. For the occupier, this is a huge win, because honestly, I think we've been talking about the digital workplace, the new workplace, and flexibility for the longest time. I think what COVID has done is it's really accelerated a lot of those conversations. Spaces have not been generally utilized very effectively, and we all know that. And where you alluded to maybe some kind of POC that you were doing, right? But today there's a great opportunity for you to say, you know what, I actually want to take my full portfolio. I want to start evaluating what pieces of my portfolio I can repurpose, because I'm not going to ever get this full workforce back. So maybe I can set up an innovation center, or maybe I can go ahead and work with the landlord on setting up certain flexible areas, etc. But there's a huge ROI associated with deploying those technologies for the occupier. And absolutely, for the people that have been working at home and they have been, gotten used to a certain way, when you bring them back to the workplace, if the experience is shoddy, it starts to hit productivity, it starts to hit culture, and it starts to hit a whole bunch of things, right? But that's why people are ready to spend money on it today more than ever than they did. And I think the cost savings will pay for the technology and maybe 10 times over, right? So.
Good. I like your optimism. Anybody else want to talk to that bit about the money and who pays, and maybe share any of your own sort of approaches to those calculations? Mary, is that something that you sort of play through when you're choosing?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear Dinesh's cost savings, where the cost savings are coming from. So that would be great. But yeah, I think for us, it's everyone tries to measure productivity, and how do you put a price on that? It's truly priceless when you think about innovation, and but quantifying it for a benchmark or a KPI on the software deployment is a challenge. So that's something we're certainly looking at. When we think about optimizing our buildings for space and energy, that's a pretty easy business case, and I would say that pencils out pretty quickly. But it is kind of that unknown about, this is our projection on how we're going to use the workspace. But until we really get there and are ramped up, then we'll have to keep reevaluating. For us, Jacinda, what she said about the implementation and the integration, I think can't be understated. Just to do our pilot, it took us about a year in terms of the integration and cybersecurity reviews and approvals. So that's challenging, but I think this is a good time to start that process, because we're getting ready to ramp up. So this is an ideal time to think about that.
What are you looking for when you have potential tech partners in front of you, and maybe they've got to a short list, or what are, money's just one thing. What are the sort of key factors for you in terms of advising people that about procurement. It's such a thorny area of business.
Yeah, absolutely. So interoperability. So we do have, some technology that's built into our space, and we also have tech partners that we want to continue to use. So how do their systems talk to each other and work with each other? And on the cyber side, the the companies that come to the table really prepared for that review and aren't surprised by it, I think we're a lot, just so much easier to work with, I would say, because it certainly takes a while, and you could tell the difference between some companies seem kind of surprised by the requirements, which then surprises me that they haven't done their homework, to know that it's going to be a challenge. So I think those are probably a couple of the main things we'll look for.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Question here for you, Annie, from Adam Levinson. How does Hines approach customer research? How do you get a good grasp of what tenants want?
I mean, I think it's the good old-fashioned conversation that is something that we rely heavily on. Obviously, I talked about the sensors and some of the R&D that we're doing in our spaces, and some of that is being replicated. Like in Shanghai, the sensor data that we can get in China, I think, is a little bit different than the sensor data we're able to populate in the United States. And so we've got sensors throughout the entire building at our One Museum Place building in Shanghai. So there's lots of data that we're getting there that's telling us a lot of information about the customers. But I think at the end of the day, it's having conversations with Mary and having conversations with the different portfolio teams for our companies across the globe to find out what they are looking for. What are some of the initiatives that they're working on? How can Hines really act as a partner with them in terms of their real estate rather than just providing a service? I think, property management used to be this, low service, low touch industry, and it is rapidly shifting. And it was prior to COVID, I think even more so now into the future, but it needs to be this high touch, high engagement, high hospitality, high service industry into the future. And those are the landlords and property managements, I think, that the companies that will win. And so Hines is taking that approach and having conversations with tenants, whether it's the contact in the building, or it's the portfolio manager for all operations across the globe. We want to know what they're looking for. I know that back in January, it was interesting. We actually did a survey across our portfolio with the portfolio teams on how they plan on using flex office space into the future. Obviously, that was pre-COVID, and so it's been interesting because I've gone back now and picked up the phone and had similar conversations with people who answered those questions in January to figure out how that has shifted in the wake of COVID and what they think the next 12 to 24 to 36 months are going to look like, and would they answer it differently now that they know where we are in the current environment. And so again, I think that there's a lot that you can do from a technology and surveying standpoint, but I also think that having conversations with somebody like a Mary is going to give us more information in a 30-minute call than 3 months of sensor data is ever going to give us.
Yeah, can't beat it. And in terms of, there's another question there that sort of leads on. You've mentioned flex space a few times. That's obviously forefront of your mind at the moment. Do you think that that's basically going to wipe out the smaller sub 7,000 square foot deals on the traditional lease terms? If we fast forward sort of 12, 24 months, are we going to see that really eroded, do you think?
No, we think of flexibility as the spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum you have co-working, and on the other end you have that 5,000 foot space. And I think one of the things that we will see is the leasing process and the connection of that space to the end user. I think that is going to evolve pretty quickly. I think that we need to come up with short form leases so that we're not going through the same lease review process that you normally would for a 50,000 foot deal as you are for a 5,000 foot deal. And I think that how we give the customer access to that, talk about availability, show them the spaces, I think that is evolving pretty quickly as well. There's a number of marketplace companies out there who are providing those types of services to bring the product directly to the customer. But I don't think they're going to go away. I think what we're going to see is, spec suites over the last 5 years have been a really big thing that people are just building them. But I think they need to come along with a lot of services. I think that they need to be packaged with the technology, with the furniture. They need to be that turnkey that co-working's giving on the other end of the spectrum. I think that we need to have some of those services play over. We don't need to have Danishes and coffee provided every single day in the 5,000 foot spaces. I think that a lot of the customers can provide their own infrastructure for the most part, but we still need to make it frictionless. We still need to provide some basic services, and we need to make sure that we're giving access to those spaces quickly to the end user, because those are the ones ultimately, the 5,000 foot deals, they generally want to move in fast and they want to have it turnkey. So I think we just need to pick up some of the services that we build in co-working and drop them into the 5,000 foot. And so it continues that spectrum of flexibility rather than co-working completely erasing it.
Yeah, a blend. Jacinda, you're nodding to quite a bit of what Annie's saying there in terms of the canvassing customers and just on those last points. Is there anything that you'd like to add from your perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm nodding to a lot of things that everybody on this panel is saying. But when I think of, flexibility, flex office, the first question is, for how long do you want this space for, right? Because I still think that there's a strong case for certain businesses in certain situations to be signing long-term leases. They know that they're going to have, at least this number of folks in a given market, and they're going to be able to utilize that space on a long-term basis. And then maybe in that case, they want to have more control over the TIs and the build out and that thing, and those things. But so I think, length of lease is one form of flexibility, and we're seeing, more companies wanting shorter term leases. And then to the other points that, Annie was mentioning, do they want that to be built out? Or do they want to build it out themselves? There's definitely strong preferences there either way, but generally I think, for the shorter term, like she's saying, make sure that it's turnkey, it's ready, it's good to go. Do they want it managed? So kind of a next step further, do they want to make sure the internet is up and running and ready to go? Maybe have there be staffing there, someone at the reception to help facilitate the daily needs in that space. So I think those are the sorts of questions when, talking with different clients, just trying to understand their needs around, length of term, build out, whether it's managed, and then, is it furnished as well? Those are different kind of service layers that may or may not correlate to the length of lease.
Yeah. A question picking back up on the procurement aspect here about how do you choose wisely? Do you want to sort of just share when somebody's coming into the room to pitch, what makes a winner stand out from a loser across the table?
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate what Mary said, sort of integration, open protocol, a demonstrated investment in their engineering team to work with as many other groups in the industry and integrate in that sense. I always think about how Steve Jobs initially didn't want to have there be any Apple apps. And then, look what happened. Obviously, for that to be as efficient as it is today and provide the most value, it's an open protocol system with processes and approvals in place. But I think a lot about that. I think references are really key. So there's a lot of really good looking pitches out there. People have fantastic PowerPoint skills, but if you get on the phone and talk to people that have implemented those technologies before and kind of talk through the rubs, because there's definitely going to be challenges and different expectations between an institutional real estate company and maybe a younger startup. And then I also think you don't know until you pilot it. You can do as much due diligence as possible, but having an approach where it is trying something and not planning to scale dramatically at the onset, but just knowing going in, it's a new thing, you want to try it out and being able to fail, and just say, okay, a pilot, it's not even a failure really, like that pilot didn't really serve the need that we had. We learned a lot. How can we take those learnings and leverage them in other situations and areas of exploration? But being able and willing to do that, which I think is a little counterintuitive sometimes to big players that make big moves, but I think it's key.
Yeah, and just following on from that, the question from PJ Appleton, about the sort of efficient asset management. Is it too early from the sorts of tenant experience platforms that you've been trialing to give examples of where it's had an impact on asset management, or are there bits of evidence you can share with us, Jacinda?
Yeah, I think the key thing right now is just reconnecting with all of the building end users. This was brought up, before, but I see the consumerization of real estate is a very real thing. You're not just signing 10-year leases and getting the approval of one person in the executive suite. You're wanting to make sure that people are motivated every day to come into the building. And so I think that by establishing a format through which we can have more communication and conversation with tenants is key, especially at the asset management layer. Nuveen Real Estate is not vertically integrated, and so we hire different property management groups at different assets to be on site. And so I think reconnecting asset management with what the building end users are saying and making sure that their feedback is included directly in the budgets and capital expenditures and everything along those lines, and having data behind it instead of a room of people guessing what we think that people would want in that building. What did the survey say? And let's make that a really key piece of that decision-making process and elevate that voice within our company.
Yeah, that's great. And Dinesh, can you share some of the more powerful examples you've seen of where systems have played out to demonstrate really efficient asset management for people?
So look, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest with you, right? I kind of look at things, I used to look at things from point solutions, right? So I would treat asset management separate from employee experience and separate from kind of tenant engagement, right? But today, I think the world has moved to a full technology stack. Many of the pilots, many of the projects that have happened globally have shown that when you try to put these point products in and you try to integrate them all together, it becomes a huge challenge, right? I look at asset management as one of the categories which eventually needs to get integrated back into your space optimization, into your space management, into then eventually how employees are going to start using them. And that's where you start to get the most efficiency basically out of it. That's when you maximize on the asset that you're actually putting in, you make it very frictionless. And also, you've got to, from a technology standpoint, at some point in time, I think today, a lot of the technologies being put in the sort of building world has just been about connecting sensors, getting the data. We've got to move to AI. And when you really start moving to AI, that's when the true sort of magic happens, right? It's no different in the asset management space. You've got to think about preventive ways of solving your asset management issues. You've got to look at what is, the utilization that you're having for the asset. And it even applies for space management. So I think Mary talked a little bit about, in sort of the sense of how do you get that working properly, whether it's, the assets and you control them through your app. But different technologies in place, I would say, look at full stack, basically for sure. Work on strategies where a lot of the integration work into assets and other things have already been done. So you don't become the R&D site where people are coming in and kind of doing that for you. And I think the third is that start leveraging heavily on AI. It'll make your life easier, right? That's what we've kind of seen so far.
And can you just, for those that maybe don't know, when you talk about the jump to AI, can you just unpack that a little bit for us and elaborate? What does that look like? What's involved?
So I'll give you one simple example, right? So the whole world moved to social distancing and everybody took these tapes and started measuring, one seat from the other. And every seat I realized had 8 seats that were surrounding it, right? That sometimes took weeks and months to be able to do that, especially for people with global portfolios. In came certain very cool AI algorithms. We were able to look at floor plans, by the system automatically. And then the most optimized floor plans were suggested by the AI engine to say, you know what, if you had these seats that were used and not these seats, you'd be able to maximize the number of seats that you had, right? Now, that's where an AI engine would be much better off than doing it kind of manually, right? The second was that as you start thinking about your workforce, and your workplace, and that coming together, making decisions on which teams go in, when do they go in, what will be the maximum and the best utilization of space, blending that in with the sensor data. One is that you get the data and you make the decisions. The other is your AI recommendation engine kind of tells you what you can be doing. But there are many areas like that, Paul, and I think that's where the market's kind of headed to, right? Still,
Yeah.
I would say earlier days, but definitely that's where it's kind of moving towards.
Thank you. And final question from David Hodges for all the panel. When implementing smart spaces strategy, do you have a rule of thumb metric when calculating for ROI, for return on investment, for the investment made? Who wants to, Mary, do you want to have a first stab at that?
I was going to ask Dinesh since he sounds like he's got that calculation figured out. Yeah, I think it is getting to the hard data that's a challenge. I would say we're still struggling with it. It's easy on the utility side to calculate the savings, but for us on the space side, that's a bit of a challenge. You could look at avoided costs, but to think about an ROI, that's where I would look for some help from outside.
Okay. Anybody else
I'll
want
hop
to?
in,
Yeah,
if
please.
that's okay. And yeah, our head of sustainability would be like, Jacinda, I can't believe, like, on the asset management question, and just to underscore what Mary's already said, energy efficiency is definitely an area that is, I think kind of foundational and a little bit more broadly adopted already within the market, but for the sake of clarity, an asset that is energy efficient and that we're, doing remote diagnostics and predictive analytics around is huge. Taking that a step further and providing a level of transparency to our tenants around their energy use on a real-time basis is definitely on our roadmap as well. But as far as ROI, those you can kind of see more direct ROI immediately. A lot of the proof is kind of more indirect at this point in time, but I do tend to think it comes down to attraction and retention. So attraction and retention for our tenants, our clients, and then for them, attraction and retention for their employees, right? And so it's tough to measure that right now, but if you're not doing things to attract and retain that talent, you know that it's going to have a very adverse and material financial impact on the company.
Yeah, pretty fundamental. Annie, anything to add to the above?
Yeah, I think it really depends on where you are in the R&D phase, and so if it's truly just an initial trial of a product versus if you're starting to deploy it on a larger scale, I think that there are different metrics that you need to look at. We tend not to look as much as on ROI when we're doing our very initial research and trying to determine different products against each other, because frankly, that's not what the ultimate goal is. If we start to then deploy a product more widespread, then there's a lot more research and details from a financial standpoint that go into it. And I think Jacinda, also had a really great point that it really, at the end of the day, makes everything more efficient. And I think that efficiency isn't only on the building side, but it's also on the people side. And so, it's hard to talk about those intangible financial impacts today, but that's also because we're in such an infancy as it relates to, this whole industry and the smart spaces that or smart items that we're putting into our building and flexibility of our buildings, et cetera. This is all something that large asset teams only started talking about recently. And so I think, in 5 years from now, we'll have a lot of data points that we can go back to and point at to say, like, those intangible elements actually had pretty tangible financial results, but we don't have that ability to do so right now because of where we are in the industry.
Yeah. Dinesh, any final thoughts to add to the ROI discussion?
No, I think, for us, we've seen a couple of things interesting at some of our larger clients. The first was they shifted from a one-to-one seating to be able to move from many to one, right? And there were smart ways to kind of do that using technology. I think that helped them with a good 10 to 15% of just space in general saving. That was one. The second was just things like meeting rooms, right? People would book them, not show up. And so how do they go back into the pool? But there was this whole thing about better utilization of spaces and making sure that they get utilized in a much better manner. So you don't need that much space, right? And so more people could be fitted into the areas that you really had. But, there are things like that you can do. And I think technology today is ready to be able to do that. Now, you do need to have the right set of technology and the right algorithms to help you with that. But Mary, I'd love to continue that discussion with you, right? Because it's an interesting one to have. So.
Yeah, absolutely. This conversation will run and run, I think. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Really valuable insights. Thank you all for sharing and tuning in from across the US and across the world. And hopefully you've been enjoying that at home and in the office, those watching. Thanks to Smarten Spaces for organising this session with PlaceTech. Thanks again to our panelists. A write-up and a video of the roundtable will appear on PlaceTech next week, so watch out for that. Yeah, thanks again.